Why the USA prepared to invade Canada, the classified 1930 invasion plan, the 51st state, Washington, D.C. The year is 1930. Deep inside the State War and Navy building, men in suits huddle over maps marked Top Secret. The world believes this is about military strategy, about protecting democracy, about the British threat across the Atlantic. But strip away the propaganda, and you find the truth. This wasn't about honor or flags or freedom. This was about gold reserves, trade routes, and who controlled the cash flow of the North American continent. They didn't plan War Plan Red because they feared Britain's army. They planned it because they feared Britain's banks. Think you know the story of American-Canadian relations? Think again. This is the Cinematic History Tales channel, and today we're opening the vault on one of the most shocking financial conspiracies in modern history. The story you're about to hear has been sanitized, redacted, and buried in the footnotes of official histories. But the numbers don't lie, and the ledger always tells the truth. Subscribe now, because when the real history is revealed, you'll want to say you knew it first. In the Roaring '20s, the United States stood as the world's emerging financial superpower. Gold bullion filled the vaults of the Federal Reserve in quantities that made European bankers sweat at night. American factories produced more steel, more oil, more automobiles than any nation in human history. Wall Street had replaced London as the beating heart of global finance, and the dollar was beginning its long march toward reserve currency status. The skyline of New York City rose higher each year, a testament to raw capital accumulation. The United States had lent billions to Europe during the Great War, and now it was time to collect. But across the Atlantic, the old master refused to bow. The British Empire still painted a quarter of the world map red, still controlled the critical sea lanes, still held dominion over Canada, Australia, India, and vast stretches of Africa. The pound sterling remained the default currency for international trade, backed by centuries of colonial wealth extraction. British banks financed projects from Singapore to South Africa, collecting interest that flowed back to London like tributaries feeding a great river. And Britain owed the United States over $4 billion in war debts, money borrowed to purchase American guns, American steel, American food, money they showed no enthusiasm for repaying. The tension wasn't about ideology or democracy. It was about market share. American oil companies wanted access to Persian Gulf reserves that Britain jealously guarded through puppet governments and colonial treaties. American rubber manufacturers needed the plantations of Malaya and Ceylon, territories firmly under British commercial control. American shipping lines competed for routes that British maritime law had dominated for 2 centuries. Every trade negotiation became a quiet battle for economic supremacy. Every international conference featured American and British delegations circling each other like sharks, smiling for the cameras while their accountants counted tonnage and calculated margins. The admirals understood what the public did not. Naval power wasn't measured in courage or tradition. It was measured in fuel oil and steel production capacity, in the ability to maintain supply lines 5,000 miles from home. Britain's Royal Navy was larger, but American shipyards could outproduce British yards 3-1. Britain controlled more territory, but American agriculture could feed an army indefinitely without importing a single grain of wheat. The balance of power was shifting, and the British establishment knew it. So did the men in Washington, and both sides began to prepare. In the basement offices where strategic planners worked, far from public scrutiny, a realization crystallized. If conflict erupted with Britain, the Atlantic Ocean was too wide and the Royal Navy too entrenched to risk a direct assault on the British Isles. Any attempted invasion of England would require a naval superiority America didn't yet possess, and a logistical miracle that even American industrial might couldn't guarantee. But there was another option, a vulnerability in the British imperial system that was impossible to ignore. Right across the northern border, flying the Union Jack and legally bound to fight for the crown, sat Canada. 3,000 miles of border, much of it undefended. A landmass rich in resources connected by rail lines that could be cut, harboring ports that could be seized. Canada wasn't a friendly neighbor in this calculus. Canada was collateral. The planners assigned every potential enemy a color code. Blue for the United States, red for Great Britain, black for Germany, orange for Japan, and crimson for Canada. The designation told you everything about how Washington viewed its northern neighbor. Not a sovereign nation making its own choices, but an extension of British power, a military asset that would be activated the moment London declared war. The legal reality was undeniable. As a British dominion, Canada had no choice. If Britain fought, Canada fought. Therefore, Canada was a threat, and threats had to be neutralized before they could be used. Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan Red emerged from this cold logic. The document ran to hundreds of pages, complete with detailed maps, troop movement schedules, and calculations of ammunition requirements. It identified every strategic target from Halifax to Vancouver, every rail junction, every industrial center, every harbor that could receive British reinforcements. The plan's genius lay in its ruthless efficiency. Canada would be carved into isolated sectors through simultaneous strikes, preventing provinces from coordinating defense or pooling resources. Speed was paramount. Knock out Canadian resistance before Britain could mobilize transatlantic support. Secure the continent, then negotiate from a position of absolute strength. Let's talk about Halifax. On paper, it was a modest port city in Nova Scotia, with a population barely reaching 50,000 souls. But in the ledger of strategic assets, Halifax was priceless. It hosted the headquarters of the Royal Canadian Navy and possessed the only major Atlantic port north of Boston that remained ice-free throughout winter. British troop ships, British supply convoys, British naval reinforcements, all would have to flow through Halifax to support any Canadian defense. Control Halifax, and you control the maritime lifeline between Britain and its North American dominion. Lose Halifax, and Canada was cut off. War Plan Red allocated 25,000 Marines for the Halifax operation. The battle plan was textbook amphibious assault, refined from lessons learned in previous conflicts and adapted to Canadian geography. Naval bombardment would commence at dawn, targeting coastal fortifications and communication infrastructure. Battleships would pummel the harbor defenses into rubble, while destroyers laid down suppressing fire on the beaches. Then the landing craft would hit the shore, wave after wave of American infantry storming positions held by outnumbered Canadian defenders. The objective wasn't occupation. The objective was demolition. Destroy the docks, crater the rail yards, cut every telegraph and telephone cable. Make Halifax useless as a military asset. Buried in the appendices, and language carefully crafted to sound clinical and professional, was authorization for chemical warfare. The planners worried that Canadian forces might dig in, might create trench systems similar to those that had turned World War I into a blood-soaked stalemate. They worried about urban combat in Halifax's narrow streets, about a prolonged siege that would drain American resources and buy time for British intervention. So they recommended poison gas, chlorine or phosgene delivered by artillery shells, would clear trenches and break defensive positions without the need for costly frontal assaults. Never mind that the Geneva Protocol had banned chemical weapons 8 years earlier. Never mind that the United States had signed that treaty. In the cold mathematics of War Plan Red, morality was a luxury. Victory was the mandate. Think about the scale of that. American generals sat in Washington and calmly discussed gassing Canadian civilians defending their own cities. Not in the heat of battle, not as a desperate last resort, but as a calculated first strike option to improve operational efficiency. Because in their analysis, this wasn't murder. This was asset acquisition. The faster Halifax fell, the lower the total cost in American lives and American dollars. The chemical weapons were just another line item in the budget, another tool in the arsenal. The ledger didn't care about the choking, the burning lungs, the bodies in the streets. The ledger only cared about speed and certainty. The second prong of the invasion targeted Quebec. The planners recognized that Quebec's cultural distinctness and historical tensions with English Canada presented an opportunity for exploitation. A propaganda campaign would be launched before the first shot was fired, promising Quebec autonomy, promising freedom from British imperialism, promising economic benefits from American integration. Meanwhile, military columns would drive north from Vermont and New York, advancing along the natural corridors provided by the Richelieu River and Lake Champlain. The goal was to seize Montreal within 72 hours. Montreal was Canada's financial capital, home to the major banks and the stock exchange that financed Canadian industry. Capture Montreal, and you decapitated Canada's ability to fund its own defense. The numbers were coldly specific. 3 infantry divisions, supported by mechanized artillery and the fledgling Army Air Corps, would cross the border at multiple points to prevent a concentrated Canadian response. Bomber squadrons would target rail bridges and power stations, cutting Montreal off from reinforcement while simultaneously destroying the infrastructure needed to move Canadian troops west or east. American intelligence had already mapped every factory, every warehouse, every government building worth capturing. They knew which banks held the gold reserves, which rail yards controlled freight movement, which power plants kept the city's lights burning. This wasn't invasion. This was hostile corporate takeover executed with artillery. Ontario, the industrial heartland, would be split by a rapid advance toward Niagara Falls and Windsor. These weren't just cities. They were economic jugulars. The hydroelectric plants at Niagara powered much of Ontario's manufacturing base, producing the electricity that ran the steel mills, the munitions factories, the textile plants. Seize the power generation, and you could shut down Canadian war production overnight. Windsor sat directly across from Detroit, connected by bridge and tunnel, representing the tightest economic integration along the entire border. American factories in Detroit depended on Canadian parts. Canadian factories in Windsor assembled products for American markets. The invasion plan called for securing both sides of the border simultaneously, less like a military operation and more like a corporate merger enforced at gunpoint. The Western Front focused on Winnipeg and the Prairie provinces, Winnipeg controlled the rail junction that connected eastern Canada to the Pacific coast. Every train carrying grain to market, every shipment of supplies to western garrisons, every telegraph message coordinating national defense passed through Winnipeg's rail yards. American forces driving north from North Dakota and Minnesota would race to cut those rail lines, trapping Canadian forces in British Columbia and preventing reinforcement from the east. With Winnipeg isolated, the prairie provinces would be economically strangled. No exports, no imports, no communication. The farms might still grow wheat, but that wheat couldn't reach markets. The mines might still produce minerals, but those minerals couldn't be shipped. Economic collapse would follow military occupation within weeks. British Columbia presented unique challenges. Vancouver was nearly 1,500 miles from the nearest American military base, separated by mountain ranges and vast stretches of undeveloped territory. A land invasion from the south would be slow and costly, so War Plan Red called for a naval blockade. American warships operating out of Puget Sound would seal off the port of Vancouver, preventing Japanese or British ships from delivering supplies or evacuating Canadian gold reserves. Without resupply from the Pacific, British Columbia would wither on the vine. The plan anticipated that civilian resistance would crumble once food shortages began, once the population realized that no help was coming. Sovereignty is solvency, and bankruptcy breeds surrender faster than any military defeat. The financial calculations behind War Plan Red revealed the true nature of the strategy. The planners estimated that total conquest of Canada could be achieved in 6 months at a cost of roughly $2 billion. That sounds enormous until you compare it to the $4 billion Britain owed the United States in war debts. From a purely balance sheet perspective, invading Canada was cheaper than waiting for Britain to repay what it had borrowed, and the resource acquisition alone justified the investment. Canada's nickel deposits supplied 70% of global demand, essential for steel production and armaments. Canada's lumber fed American construction. Canada's grain stabilized American food prices. Annexing Canada wouldn't just eliminate a potential threat. It would add billions in resource value to the American economy, pay for the invasion several times over, and establish the United States as an uncontestable continental superpower. But there was another layer beneath even these calculations. The American financial establishment understood that Britain's refusal to repay war debts threatened the entire structure of international finance. If Britain could default with impunity, why would any debtor nation honor its obligations? The precedent was dangerous. It suggested that military power could trump financial contracts, that empires could borrow and spend without consequence. Wall Street needed to send a message, and that message had to be written in a language that London's bankers would understand. Invading Canada wouldn't just be military conquest. It would be foreclosure. Britain had borrowed American money, and if Britain couldn't pay, America would seize British assets. It was repo man logic applied to geopolitics. The plan remained classified for decades. The general public knew nothing of the detailed invasion schedules, the chemical weapon authorizations, the cynical calculations of profit and loss. Official histories painted the 20s and 30s as a time of American isolationism, of a nation reluctant to engage in foreign adventures. But the documents told a different story. Behind closed doors, in secured rooms where only men with the highest clearances could enter, America was preparing to swallow its northern neighbor whole. Not out of aggression for aggression's sake, not out of territorial ambition or imperial ego, but because the math made sense, because the resources were there, because the British Empire was vulnerable, because war, when properly executed, was just business by other means. The great irony is that War Plan Red was never executed, but its logic played out anyway. The Second World War forced Britain into even deeper debt, this time borrowing on a scale that dwarfed the First World War's financial burden. American Lend-Lease provided Britain with $50 billion in military supplies, food, and equipment. Britain paid for that generosity by selling off its foreign assets, by liquidating its investments in South America and Asia, by accepting American troops on British soil and American voices in British strategic decisions. The pound sterling lost its reserve currency status. The British Empire began its long dissolution, shedding colonies it could no longer afford to administer or defend. By 1945, Britain was bankrupt in everything but name. The final payment on Britain's World War II debts to the United States wasn't made until December 31st, 2006. 61 years after the war ended, the British Treasury wrote a check for $83 million and closed the books. 2 generations lived under the shadow of that debt. 2 generations of British citizens saw their taxes siphoned off to pay interest on money borrowed when their grandparents were young. The debt reshaped British society, forced austerity programs, drove the dismantling of the empire that had once ruled the waves. The Americans never had to invade Canada. They didn't need to. The debt did the work for them. Financial conquest is slower than military conquest, but it's far more thorough. It's permanent. Canada, meanwhile, emerged from the shadow of the British Empire only to fall into the economic orbit of the United States. Today, 75% of Canadian exports flow south of the border. American corporations own vast swaths of Canadian resource extraction industries. The economies are so intertwined that a recession in Detroit causes layoffs in Windsor, a housing crisis in Seattle drives up prices in Vancouver. The military invasion outlined in War Plan Red never happened, but the economic integration it envisioned is now reality. Canada maintained its political independence, its flag and its parliament and its national identity. But economically, functionally, Canada operates as an extension of the American market. The ledger accomplished what the Marines were prepared to do by force. This is the lesson that history textbooks don't teach. Wars are not won on battlefields. Wars are won in treasury departments and central banks and commodity exchanges. The generals plan the tactics, but the accountants determine the outcome. You can have the bravest soldiers, the most advanced weapons, the most brilliant commanders, but if you can't pay them, if you can't feed them, if you can't keep the factories running and the supply lines open, you lose. Sovereignty is solvency. The moment your creditors call in the debt, the moment your currency collapses, the moment you can't make payroll, your nation ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. You become a ward, a protectorate, a subsidiary of whoever holds your bonds. War Plan Red was never just about Canada. It was about establishing a new world order where financial power trumped military tradition, where the balance sheet mattered more than the battle standard. The British Empire learned that lesson the hard way. Canada survived by accepting its place in the new hierarchy. And the United States, emerging from the chaos of the 20th century as the world's preeminent superpower, proved that empire in the modern age doesn't require colonies. It only requires control of the money supply. Everything else follows from that. The bombs and the tanks and the invasion plans are just insurance policies, rarely used, but always ready. The real weapon is debt. Always has been. Always will be.